Hi, my name is Theo Gonzalez, and welcome to Viral Histories, Stories of Racism, Resilience, and Resistance. In this series, we'll explore some of the voices from the Asian American community as it responds to a major public health emergency. Today, we're speaking with Abigaile de Mesa, who is a supervising nurse living and working in New Jersey. Since the 1960s, more than 150,000 nurses from the Philippines have migrated to the United States. But the presence of Filipino nurses in the United States is not a new phenomenon. According to the work of Catherine Sinisa Choi, who teaches at the University of California at Berkeley, the history of Filipino nurses in the United States goes back several generations to the years after the conclusion of the US-Philippine War in the early 1900s. Today, we'll be talking with one of the nurses who's been on the front lines of this pandemic. My co-host for the series is Lintaro Donovan, who is a high school student in Maryland.
Hello, America. Break your backs for dollars, they don't carry ya. 7,000 miles away from home with language barriers. Land of opportunity. Tell me, is it good?
Well, Abby, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for everything that you're doing on the front lines of this pandemic. While you've been, treating and dealing with this pandemic, what, I guess, specific challenges have you faced in your profession?
That is definitely one of the, I guess, biggest, one of the biggest, I could say, for all of us at work. The longer hours, usually we work, well, for us, we work 12-hour shifts. A lot of us, we're working past that 13, 14 hours just to make sure we finish everything. What was great was my team picked up some hours just to help out. So, because we knew some people were sick, some picked up some days where they would come in. If they could come in for like 3 to 4 hours, which is great because I had spoken to our director about this. Can they come in at least for like 3 to 4 hours just to be the helper kind of thing? And, of course, whatever helps. So she agreed to it. And there's people that actually, some of the nurses would come in on their days off and come in for at least a short amount of 3 to 4 hours, 5 hours, whatever it could.
And that's just because of the major crush of people that are coming into the ward.
Yeah. And because we also knew how hard it is while we're on duty, not having that extra help. So yeah, it was really good that that's one of the main things, I guess, that kind of kept us going is our teamwork and just our, all around. I mean, we've even prior to this, I could say that on my unit, we all have a great teamwork and a good relationship amongst each other. So at work and outside of work. So that's kind of helped with this pandemic. Our unit actually turned into a COVID unit. So all of our patients are either what you call PUI, which is patient under investigation, which is when we don't know whether they have it or not, and the positives. So easily on a normal day, the nurses are great with their time management and they can finish off their meds within an hour or so. This time it was taking a little bit longer because we would have to think about what else we're going to take in that room aside from our medications. So that way we could limit our exposure in and out, and as well as our PPEs. So we're not always gowning and degowning.
Abby, could I ask, what's the kind of protective gear that you normally wear, and how is it different for this pandemic?
So we basically have to wear goggles, a mask, a surgical mask, and our gowns and gloves. That's usually our standard PPE. Now, big difference because of the pandemic, we have to wear our N95 mask throughout the day. Of course, we protect that with a surgical mask over it. That way, we also we try to limit our resources so that way we can use it throughout the entire day.
So the surgical mask over gets used from patient to patient, or that gets disposed of after you see a patient, but the N95 mask stays on all day.
Yeah.
And so the images that we've seen on the media where there are like marks on nurses' faces and other person's faces, that's because the mask is on so tight?
Correct. It's tight and it's on the entire, for the most part, the entire day. Yeah. I mean, it's fitted. So we're actually tested for that yearly. Um,
Mhm.
by it's called fit testing. So we have to make sure it's actually fitted right. And there's different sizes to it. There's a small and a regular size, and there's also different kinds of N95. There's the duckbill or the round ones. And each time we get something new like this, we have to make sure it's fitted so that way it's working properly.
And how breathable is it after 3 or 4 hours of having that on?
It's
How
hard to
comfortable
breathe.
is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a bit uncomfortable. Yeah, having it on for maybe more than 4 hours, would say, or it depends on the person as well. Some can tolerate it longer. It's just more so of also that it hurts here by the bridge of our nose.
Mm.
But the hospital did supply us with patches that helps. Or sometimes the nurses were just wearing like bandages over here or here, or so on our cheekbones.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Abby, I know you come from a family of nurses. You're the daughter of a nurse, and there's probably at least something like at least a dozen nurses in your family in different parts of the
Mhm.
country. How did you get started in the profession, and what was it like to grow up in a family of other nurses?
It was nice, actually. Well, I got into it because I did want to stay into the medical field. Um, I thought about being a pediatrician versus a nurse, but I went to the nursing route. And it was nice to have that background too, because then you kind of see how it is initially before going into something. Because of course, everybody's like that unknown is always the biggest anxiety factor for everyone. But um, having someone to talk to about how to get into this career or different specialties also, because a lot of like within my family, they're all in different areas. There's one in the emergency room or ICU or dialysis or the operating room. So it was nice to kind of see and talk to different family members about how things go.
Coming from this legacy, or rather, I'll backtrack a little bit. I'm an Asian American, and I know a lot of my friends, and myself included, have felt, I guess, a little bit uncomfortable during this pandemic because of a lot of the connotations and a lot of the, I guess, rhetoric and vitriol going around, where Asian Americans are sort of being a targeted group or being targeted during this
Hmm.
pandemic, and certain other Asian ethnicities and cultures are being blamed for spreading the pandemic, things
Hmm.
like that. I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile your identity as an Asian American with this critical job that you have to play during the pandemic? Have you felt any sort of uncomfortability? Have you faced any discrimination from people who might be prejudiced?
No, fortunately not.
Mhm.
And even I guess within our community is very diverse. So aside from me, I have also a good amount of coworkers that are Asian American, and
Mhm.
we all haven't really felt any sort of discrimination or hate towards when we're walking out in the street or anything really at all. No. Um,
Mhm.
so we've been fortunate enough about that. Yeah.
And Abby, where you work, are there a lot of other Filipino American nurses, Filipino nurses?
Yeah, plenty.
Yeah.
I can't really say how many, but there's plenty.
During this pandemic, just how important have you found those fellow relationships with your,
Mhm.
fellow healthcare workers, with your fellow nurses?
Very important, especially this time. It helps you gather together even more and build a stronger relationship. Um, for these times, mentally, emotionally, physically, and having them around you kind of helps. Just brings your spirit up.
Abby, it's been great to talk with you. Lintar, did you have any other questions that you want to follow up with?
Um, I think just one last good closing question. During this pandemic, what have you sort of realized that we take for granted in modern society? Um, and just, do you have any lessons, words of wisdom that you think would be great for the rest of us to remember, especially during this really frustrating time period?
I think what we took for granted is just being able to do our daily activity without any worry, stepping out, doing anything, just going about it freely. was really a big thing for everyone, I think, because, you know, a lot of people are just restrained to staying home. Of course, we have to think about, I mean, we can be healthy and walking around, but who knows if we could spread it to our loved ones. I think that was like the biggest thing that we all kind of took for granted, and just being with family more so. So I think moving forward, I think we just have to just think back to this, and how did we cope, who, you know, who was around us, and how did we manage to just keep our spirits up and kind of just come along together.
Thank you to Abigaile de Mesa and to our co-host Lintaro Donovan. Hi there, folks. I'm Theo Gonzalez, and I'm a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Thank you for joining us for this live segment of Viral Histories. This is the second episode of a 4-part series. In this segment, we hope that you can ask some questions, dig deeper into the topic, and walk away with some new understandings of how our past continues to inform our present. This week, we started off with Max Leung, who was the founder of the San Francisco Peace Collective. That was yesterday's conversation. Tomorrow we'll be up with Russell Jung, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. On Thursday, we have Genevieve Villamora, who's the co-owner of Bad Saint, a restaurant in Washington, D.C. And on Friday, we'll be closing out with the work of Grace Young, the cookbook author, who's created a series of videos around New York City's Chinatown. So let's start off with some ground rules for our discussion. Please send in your questions to the chat box for this program. We ask that you do not put any private or personal information in there. If you are a parent or a teacher watching with your students, we encourage you to actively watch with them. Also, please be respectful of those talking or sharing questions and thoughts in the chat. Listen with an open mind. Assume the best intentions, as we're all in this together. We expect all comments to be respectful and appropriate. So joining me today, we have our co-host, Lintaro Donovan, who is a high school senior. He's graduating. He's from Maryland. And we have our very special guest all week. That's Ruby Ibarra, and you heard her music just at the beginning, rapper, producer, and activist. So Lintaro and Ruby, let's get your comments about this conversation that we had with Abigaile. And Ruby, why don't we start off with you?
So first off, I wanted to say that I really enjoyed Abby's interview. Thank you so much, Abby, for sharing your experience being one of the frontline workers right now. When I think about the pandemic, I think about obviously everyone that's been affected by this, but I can't help but also be inspired by all the frontline workers and first responders who are really there doing the groundwork day to day, working hours on end. Continuing to give us care and making sure that we continue to move as a community. So thank you so much for everyone that's been risking their lives and really are at the front lines of all of this. And I really was fascinated, hearing about Abby's experience, particularly the part about them wearing masks for such a long period of time. I think that to me stood out because in addition to her story, I have heard about other nurses and doctors as well, as I continue to watch the news on television. And I've seen those photos also on social media of frontline workers with, marks on their faces because they've been wearing these masks for so long. And to me, that just highlights the fact that, they're really risking, their safety and their lives by working in the front lines. So thank you so much, and hats off to everyone that are part of that group.
Yeah. Lintaro, your comment?
Yeah, I completely agree. I want to thank Abigaile first because of that amazing and productive discussion. But I think that during this pandemic, we hear all about the heroes and we honor them. We hear about them on the news and we say, wow, those are some amazing stories. But we very rarely actually hear from the heroes themselves. I think part of that is the fact that they're just working that hard. Newspaper people, journalists can't really get access to those facilities because of security and health concerns. But these people are really experiencing the pandemic in a way that, us going into a line at the grocery store are not really experiencing. They're the ones experiencing the brunt of the death. And they really are facing one of those really high burdens. They're putting themselves at risk. So I just really love that conversation and that we got that first person perspective of someone who is not only just scared of the pandemic, but has to actively confront it every time she goes to work. I just thought that was incredibly powerful. And I think that the news as a whole and our society as a whole should really look towards those heroic perspectives instead of just saying, wow, there are heroes. They have a story to tell as well.
Yeah, usually when we think about these folks on the front line, we're usually happy to thank them for their service, of course, and it's not something that we hear about often in terms of their own sense of fear, either as firefighters going into buildings or as law enforcers on the street, or now especially as nurses and other healthcare professionals taking care of the rest of us. And I'm thinking about these two articles that just came out recently, one in the New York Times and one in the LA Times. And there's a nurse by the name of Gigi Narisma Estabillo. And she just said in this one article, she said, "We are scared." Another one, Joanna Buendia, in the New York Times, she said, "The common denominator among all of us is that we're all scared." And I think, again, it's something we rarely talk about, something we rarely hear, is that the folks who are doing this kind of frontline work themselves have a palpable amount of fear as they do the work. And it's not enough, I think, for us to thank them, but to really recognize the real human costs of what it means to do this work. I want to get into this idea about, excuse me, this idea that there's a legacy, especially of Filipinos doing nursing work, healthcare work, and what we're realizing is that anywhere from nearly 1 in 5 nurses in the state of California, and it's about the same number, nearly 1 in 5 in the New York metropolitan area, are persons of Filipino descent. I mean, that's quite a huge number of folks. I'd like to get your reactions, Ruby and Lintaro, about what you think that means in terms of this really large proportion of Asian Americans and specifically Filipino Americans who are doing that kind of nursing work. Lintaro first, sorry.
Personally, I just think it's so ironic how all these people with prejudice are saying that Asian Americans are spreading this pandemic or blaming them through some sort of mental acrobatics that they're responsible for this pandemic, when quite honestly, it is Filipino Americans, it is Asian Americans who many times are on the front lines. They're the people taking care of the people who are infected. So I just think that that's a point, and I think that's a point worth making, and that's something that I think this nation as a whole should really remember. Asian Americans have played an integral role in our history. And sometimes they have also been the victims of some of the great oppressions in our history. For example, the experience of the Chinese Americans in California or Japanese Americans during internment. But even today, we still see minorities, Asian American minorities like Filipino Americans making a huge impact, and not only an impact, but literally keeping us alive.
Ruby, the Filipino nurses are bearing the brunt of this pandemic. What do you think about that?
I completely agree with Lintaro's points. And For me, when I think about nursing, growing up, that was honestly one of the possible career choices for myself. I grew up with aunts in the nursing field, with my mom's friends being in the nursing field. So it was really just within my community and the profession that I saw all around me. And now that we're in this pandemic, and as Lintaro mentioned, it's interesting to see that, I guess, side by side in juxtaposition where, in one hand, we see a lot of Asian Americans, specifically Filipino Americans in the healthcare field. And on the other hand, we see this growing rise in xenophobia towards the Asian American community. So that's why it was particularly interesting for me to hear about Abby's experience and see how her experience has been throughout all of this. Because as you both have mentioned, it's one thing to thank the frontline workers, but to hear their perspective, to hear their experience, and to actually humanize them, I think that's what we need to continue to do.
Got it.
Definitely.
Let's think about this. We are part of a history museum, so I've got to ask a question about history. So when we think about Filipino nurses currently, even though there's a large number of these nurses in the United States, 150,000 of them throughout the United States, we have to think about this as really being part of a longer history of U.S. empire in the Philippines. And if we think about the work of Catherine Sinisa Choi, who wrote this fantastic book called Empire of Care in 2003, she's really been the researcher to really unlock a lot of these stories. One of the main things that she's pointing out is that this contemporary situation that we find with Filipino nurses is really actually historical. It goes back right to the beginning of the 20th century when the United States and the Philippines were locked into a war. And soon after that war concluded, you have the active training of nurses in the Philippines being exported directly to the United States. So rather than kind of think about this as a really contemporary circumstance, a post-1965 circumstance, really is going back all the way to these histories of empire, and has a really long duration of waves of nurses, hundreds of thousands, and it's linked because of this history of empire. I want to ask you, Ruby, about your thoughts about this, because as we think about the kinds of things that we go through, these experiences, sometimes we really can only see the shore in front of us, and what's really evident is in a crisis like this, there are really waves that are starting out from much further out. How does this figure in your own work when you think about historical memory impacting us in the present?
First, I want to say I'm glad that you highlighted Empire of Care. I was fortunate enough to see Catherine's talk last year when she was at a university here in the Bay Area. And when I think about nursing and the history, I'm really not surprised that it's tied into a lot of U.S. imperialism and colonialism, and that to me just gives me a reminder that history is cyclic. What we saw then and now are not too much different, where you have Filipino American nurses in the healthcare field who at the same time are in the middle of, whether it's a pandemic or a war, seeing themselves treat demographics or communities that may even sometimes villainize them, and that is an interesting juxtaposition, and something I think worth thinking about, because we find ourselves in a similar position now, and also with healthcare, I'd also like to note that there has been also a history of not just Filipino Americans, but I think people of color in general that do find themselves in professions that are aligned with serving others and providing that kind of service.
Mm-hmm. Lintaro, your thoughts on this? Let me ask you, since you're graduating from high school this year, were these topics of U.S.-Philippine War, even the Spanish-American War, were they covered in your high school curriculum?
I would like to say that they were. We did, in my 9th grade history class, have a pretty large unit on America's expansion into the Pacific, our incursions into the Philippines, the Commonwealth. But the Philippines and the Spanish-American War were in no means the focus. American Empire was more just like a topic that we touched on, and we're like, yeah, that happened. We had colonies for like 50 years, but it was something that we sort of ignored. And just adding on to what you said, Ruby, I think we should also focus when it comes to this discussion of the healthcare field. I think it's just very interesting how the immigrant experience is very inextricably tied to healthcare, to service professions. Just like you mentioned, I know I think when it comes to immigrants coming to America, there's a sense of legacy. A couple people will come from one village. They will establish, I guess, a foothold. They will start to make their life in one job. And then from generation to generation, you see more and more immigrants from that family or that village coming to America and establishing themselves in the same field or job. For the Japanese Americans, it was farming in California and in Hawaii. For Filipino Americans, especially Filipino American women, it was in nursing and in healthcare. And I think you see that in a whole lot of Asian American and Latino American and all other immigrant communities. And I just think it's very important for us to remember that these jobs are not only jobs to the people who work in them. For Filipino American women and nurses, these are really family legacies. These are family traditions. They want to do this not only because they want to help people, but because their ancestors did it. And I think that's something that we should really just honor more. I don't think we really look at the contributions of immigrants, not only when they come to America, but from generation to generation.
Yeah. So Lintaro, thanks for pointing out those histories. I want to make sure that all of you as educators, parents, teachers, and other learners can benefit from the fact that the Smithsonian has a learning lab. And these are digital resources that everyone can dip into. It's at the click of a link. You can search by topic, and the Viral Histories series actually has several learning lab modules that you can take a look at. And here you'll see all of the videos that will be archived, but you can think about going into a deeper dive concerning the history of the US-Philippine War. What are those kinds of legacies? This new documentary series that has just premiered on PBS called Asian Americans, it starts off, it's a 5-hour series. It starts off with the history of Filipinos in St. Louis coming after that war to that World's Fair in 1904. So there's an integral part of this history, and what we can do with these learning labs is that you can take some time to take a look at some objects that we have in our collection. The other parts of the Smithsonian are also available as well in terms of music sources and samples and articles and other things that our research staff has been up to. So we want to make sure that you take a look at these resources. These learning labs are a part of it, and you can think about you can find them in the links associated with this broadcast. So let's deal with a first question, and we'll go back a little bit here. It says, what are your thoughts about leading into discomfort? What can we learn from feelings of fear? Who wants to take that first?
I've had a little bit of a, I guess, experience with fear lately. Yeah, obviously, this is in no way as heavy or as threatening as the fear that I'm sure some of these healthcare workers feel on a daily basis. But recently, I've been trying to take some walks outside during the nighttime without a flashlight, because I think that I've generally just been wary of, walking in a dark forest at night. And that's something that I've wanted to change. And in the course of taking these walks, I've sort of realized that I don't want to make this sound cliche, but the more you lean into that discomfort, the more you lean into that fear, the more you usually end up loving that thing, and the better that you usually get at it. So in the case of walking at night, I might, eventually turn that habit into running at night. And I think it's the same thing for a lot of people when it comes to these professions that require them to really put themselves on the line. I'm sure that these healthcare workers, once they get past that, that first fear, which I think, all of us feel when, it's our first time being a surgeon, it's our first time being a nurse, being on duty, it's our first time, as a college student, which I will be next year. I think that once you lean into that, you only get better at it. And I know for my family members, that have had to take those first steps, be it, as teachers or lawyers or whatever jobs they've had, they only get better at it once they embrace that discomfort. And I think that as a whole during this pandemic, we are all uncomfortable. We're all facing circumstances that we never thought we'd have to face. I think it's up to us to embrace the new time that we might get to ourselves, to embrace the professional opportunities, and to get better at whatever we want to get at.
Yeah. It's perfect that we have a musical artist like Ruby with us, because it's oftentimes artists that help us transform fear into something powerful. And one of the things that we realize with the history of the blues in the United States is having the blues isn't the same thing as singing them. And what does it mean to you, Ruby, these questions about discomfort, fear, because it really is part of a larger topic about trauma and all the other forms of discomfort and pain and rage. How would you interpret this question?
For my personal experience, like Lantaro mentioned, this pandemic has, for a lot of people, such as myself, have really put us in a position where, it's a time of uncertainty, where we don't know what tomorrow looks like, much more than, what the next 6 months is going to look like. And so for me, speaking from a perspective as an artist, I've always been accustomed to planning out the rest of my year, creating a schedule for myself, and creating goals for myself. But now that we're kind of in a standstill, not only in this nation, but globally, I'm now in a situation where I really can't plan anything. I can't plan a tour. I can't plan an album release because I don't know what the next 3 months are going to look like. And what all of this has led me to learn is that it's okay to have, moments of uncertainty. It's okay to have moments of fear. And ultimately what I've done is just I've accepted that by realizing that I'm not alone in this situation. Everyone else is facing the same thing, and that's really humbled me. And I think also it's also made me think about being present in the moment. I think prior to the pandemic, I'm sure with being a student, Lantaro or Theo as a professional yourself, we're sometimes put kind of into the mix of things where on a daily basis we have A, B, and C to execute, and next thing we know, the year's already flown by. So for me, the silver lining has been getting a moment to be present and getting a moment to reflect not only on the past but what's going on as well, in the present. And similar to what Lantaro said, I've really also learned to lean into the discomfort and realize that even though I'm uncertain, and with my career or also just in life in general, it's made me more open to not only finding myself or hearing my thoughts, but also open to hearing what others are going through and being more open-minded. And it's also, I think, leaning into the fear or into this discomfort has also made me a stronger person at the end of it.
I think it's important that we consider how, especially Asian Americans, Ruby, are accessing or not accessing mental health resources, that we make sure that we're also encouraging folks to reach out wherever possible, using these mediums as much as possible, technology, to make sure that we're in contact, talking to each other, reaching out, and making those connections. One of the things that kind of bothers me about the concept of social distancing is that we really don't want to be socially distant. We want to be actually socially connected. Physically distant, yes, but we need to be able to make use of those resources, especially those mental health resources, when we need them the most. Thank you both for your responses. Let's think about this other question that's showing up here. How do you think cultural expectations for Filipino and other API involvement in the medical field might change in the future? I suppose that's in response to this pandemic. How can we support our youth facing this future? Who wants to take that first?
Well,
let's start with Lantaro.
Okay. Well, as an Asian American, I think I have faced those stereotypes pretty well. Either people have stereotyped me, or my friends and I, who are also Asian, have joked about it. Becoming a doctor or a lawyer is sort of the Asian immigrant parents' dream for their child. So that the idea of becoming a doctor has never been alien to me. It's always been either a joke or something that my friends would talk about. But I think now we sort of realize that it isn't just another profession. It's a profession just like being a soldier, just like being a police officer, where people are putting their lives at risk to save others. And as the coronavirus and as other infectious diseases start to arise, which I think we're starting to see that, we're talking about superbugs, we're talking about new waves of COVID-19. as these things start to come up and we realize that this pandemic might actually be the first in a long line of new threats, I think we're going to realize that we're going to have more doctors and nurses and health assistants, that kids are going to have to fill these roles. My high school peers and people's children are going to have to fill these roles. And just like doctors, just like police officers and soldiers, they're going to have to put their lives at risk. So I think for a lot of Asian American kids who might, have felt pressure to become doctors or lawyers, or always felt that they wanted to become doctors or lawyers, there's this new calculus that they really have to consider. Asian parents, for one, may not, want to push their kids in that direction, in the same way that I was pushed when I was a child to move into one of those fields. So there's just a whole host of a new calculus that these parents, that Asian American children and teenagers and high schoolers and college students have to make. And I think society as a whole really has to start revaluing where they place the medical field on this pedestal of how much we pay people for their jobs, how much we pay people for their professions, how important do we see these jobs.
And to broaden that discussion, I mean, not just in terms of US society, but we're talking about the shortage of medical professionals in the United States, and the need then for nurses to be imported from other countries. This is what this brings up, is this notion of a global system of inequality in which people are required from one part of the planet to come to another in order to help with their healthcare needs. And this is something, like, again, as this pandemic is revealing, this has been part of that global system of inequality for now a century. And it's
Right.
involved the United States and the Philippines. We see Filipino nurses not only being deployed in the United States, but also in other countries like in London and Spain and the rest. And so this is really a realization that Asian American histories are actually transnational histories.
Right.
And as much as we want to think about these as national questions that demand national answers, we're also needing to kind of think about this international frame and a transnational frame for our analysis. Ruby, what do you think about this question by Pixel Oliver?
So I agree. This pandemic has really revealed just how important and essential, healthcare workers are. Similar to Lentaro, when I was growing up, again, my parents were also, in that same boat of, encouraging my sister and myself to enter the nursing field or the medical field. And, ultimately I went with biotech, which fortunately for me has also been, classified as essential workers. So during this time, I've been one of the, fortunate people who's still been able to continue work. Whereas with, my other friends who aren't in these fields, it's also made me think about, kind of the careers that they have and them not being able to make ends meet during this time. And, just it's been interesting to think about like how we value certain professions over others, I guess. And at the same time, also making me realize, again, how important healthcare workers really are for society. And I can only expect, with the next generation after this pandemic, for more students or for more of the youth to be interested or engaged, in this kind of line of work, seeing especially how critical it is to times like this. And, seeing also the shortage in nurses right now, specifically in this country. I think it was just a couple of days ago, I was watching in the news, and they were talking about how in the past month, they were encouraging nurses to help out in New York because there was a shortage specifically in the state of New York. And it also, it made me think about where we're at with immigration, seeing how they're deploying nurses from other countries and bringing them into United States, and, specifically. And, just a couple months ago, we were talking about, borders and immigration. So I think it's also interesting to think about that and how we might need to revisit those conversations.
We're definitely interconnected in that way. Any final thoughts, Lentaro, before we sign off today? We've just got a couple of minutes left.
I really liked what you said, Theo, about this transnational connection between Asia and Asian immigration with basically, fulfilling a lot of the world's needs. Filipino workers are nurses. Overseas Filipino workers also fulfill a huge variety of different roles around the United States. And I believe a really large source of income in the Philippines comes from overseas Filipino workers. We see Japanese immigrants, Chinese immigrants fulfill vital roles in American history, building the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, or the Japanese really dominating the farming industry in California up until Japanese internment. We see that today. And like Ruby said, we see Filipino nurses in London, in France. Literally the entire globe relies on Filipino nurses, on immigrant workers. And like I said before, we try to give a perfunctory, hey, they're heroes sort of look at these workers, at these immigrant workers who are risking their lives for us. And I think in the future, as we sort of rebuild from this pandemic and prepare for future biological threats that might come at us, we have to realize that these people are people. We have to be there for them, especially when they face mental health crises in the aftermath of this pandemic. We have to listen to them, and we have to obviously take their wisdom as healthcare workers, as doctors, as scientists, as all the roles that they fulfill to protect us in the future. And we just have to make sure that we don't take, as the theme of this video is, we don't take their contributions as immigrants for granted.
So we have a second part of the question, and since we have a closing minute, that question is, how do you think understanding history will empower all of us? And it's a great question, and I think one way we can think about this is that the past is never dead. In fact, the past is never past. And so when we think about this notion of history being behind us, we're trying to stress the idea that history continues to inform us. And I know Ruby knows a lot about rhyming. Well, history does rhyme, if not echoes. It's not just repeating, but it shows up in new ways and new forms. And these are the very legacies that we have to continually learn from. Ruby and Lintaro, thank you for this discussion today. I really appreciate it. We want to thank the folks behind the scenes who make the magic happen. That's Abby Pfisterer, Maria Sanchez, Eden Cho, Andrea Neighbors, and Amelia Grabowski. If you're interested in these topics, we hope you come back and visit us on americanhistory.si.edu. We'll see you next time. Thank you.